Republicans versus the governor. I'm Adrienne Pedersen, today on Up Front. Demonstrators call for an end to the safer at home order while Republicans go to court. Next, Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald on suing the governor. Is this a power struggle? Plus, coronavirus brought an abrupt halt to classroom learning, the plans in the works for the next school year, and the historic level of absentee voting in April. Did it really give Democrats an edge?
Taking on the issues important to Wisconsin. This is Up Front with your host, Adrienne Pedersen.
A big demonstration at the state capitol on Friday. People protested Governor Evers' extended safer at home order and demanded to be able to go back to work and daily activities. Thank you for joining us today. The argument over the extended order is going to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The legislature's top Republicans sued Democratic Governor Tony Evers, accusing him of executive overreach in the COVID-19 safer at home order he recently extended until May 26th. The governor countered that Republicans are making a power grab. The governor is promoting his Badger Bounce Back plan, which sets metrics for reopening Wisconsin's economy. Republicans have their own plan that will start to open things back up on May 4th. So we're talking now with Republican Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald, who filed the suit along with Assembly Speaker Robin Vos. So first of all, thank you for your time. And I want to hear it in your own words here. Why the lawsuit?
Well, I think most Wisconsinites assumed that there was a specific period of time in which an emergency declaration would last issued by the governor. And I think many legislators kind of also assumed that. We thought it would last for 60 days. And then it was up for the legislature to revisit that to see if we wanted to work with the governor to extend that. But Governor Evers completely abandoned that whole theory and simply worked under a separate set of statutes that said the Secretary of Health could pretty much do whatever she wants to do for as long as she wants to do it at his direction. So we're asking the Supreme Court to kind of weigh in on both of those issues, whether or not the 60-day emergency declaration should be adhered to and whether or not that's constitutional. And then, like I said, the second piece is, listen, we've got a process, a very formal process that we've used for hundreds of years here in Wisconsin, which is called rulemaking, which is a back and forth discussion between the executive branch and the legislative branch when you're making law. And they have completely circumvented that. And that should be alarming to everybody in Wisconsin. And we're asking the Supreme Court to weigh in on that.
Does public health not override this?
No, that's why originally both sets of statutes were created, because we understand that sometimes when there's an emergency, such as a pandemic, that there should be a nimbleness that's given to the executive branch to be able to make very quick decisions when it comes to public health. But at some point, it's, you exceed your authority by never negotiating with the legislature. And, the administration is saying, well, we've tried to talk to the legislator. We have been meeting with them. No. We're not talking about just informal conference calls. We're talking about a process that's been in place. And it absolutely has to be adhered to, or there is no balance between the two branches of government.
What specifics of the governor's safer at home order extension do you have a problem with?
Well, I think the ones that are obvious to people are the ones that just don't make any sense. Just this weekend, it looks like the tee times are going to be fully booked on every golf course in the state. Lines outside of Home Depots, Walmarts, any of those retail components that are considered essential. But when you talk about a restaurant, no, lock it down and close it up. Many of the religious services that have caused so much concern for people, it's caused a level of frustration, I think, at this point that, if the legislature was involved, I think we maybe could negotiate something that makes a lot more sense. And as a result of that, I think it would have more support. I think if people felt like they had a voice in this, that, we could come to an understanding of how long this should go on.
How do you want to reopen? What's your plan?
Right now, the two major business groups, MMAC as well as WMC, have been working on plans I have a couple of senators that have been part of that process. Nothing in concrete yet, but certainly working on trying to come up with a plan that we think makes sense for retail and restaurants to reopen in a very safe manner. And a lot of these are going to meet the guidelines that have been set by President Trump. So it's not just the Wisconsin legislature working on its own. I think there should be a back and forth with the administration to make sure we come up with a plan that makes sense instead of just continually extending the shutdown with very little explanation about what the data is that supports that, or certainly I think the governor not being able to explain consecutive days on and what the trend lines are that he's asking for. He's been asked that recently by a reporter, and he could barely even explain what the data showed or what his expectations are. That's alarming. He should have a better handle on this.
But the governor's order reflects the president's. It has the same guidelines pretty much with that 14-day downward trajectory and more testing. So do you disagree with what the president is saying as well?
Well, that's not true. I don't believe it's accurate at all. I mean, what Governor Evers did last weekend was pulled together some people at the Capitol and said, dream up something that'll be closely related to the president's plan so that we can beat back kind of some of the criticism that emerged right after he extended the order. If you look at the president's guidelines, they're pretty broad. And I think if you view the president's press conference that he's holding every day, he's made it pretty clear that it's still the governor's decisions, but they believe that there's some broader guidelines that should be adhered to.
But he said the 14-day, the president said the 14-day and the more testing.
Yeah, and so far, the governor can't even explain what Wisconsin's data is related to the 14 days. Some people believe that we've already met that, and others are saying, what's the formula, Governor Evers? And he's been unable to explain that. So it's caused a lot of confusion.
I'm wondering, two members of your caucus are calling to fire DHS Secretary Designee Andrea Palm. Do you want that?
What I think we should do is bring in the secretary and maybe ask her some of the questions that many members of my caucus have been wondering about as of late. I hope there's an opportunity for us to maybe have her come before the Health Committee and answer some of those questions. A couple members have put together a letter that's been addressed directly to the secretary that we're still waiting to get some answers on. Hopefully that'll happen soon. Because I think there is some concern about how the secretary is managing the situation right now.
And everything seems to be a fight. I mean, when we talk about the lawsuits trying to limit the governor's powers when he took over, the election, and now this, what do you say to people at home who are frustrated, who say this is just partisan politics during a pandemic?
It's pretty clear. The governor had 60 days to make these decisions, and he decided to exceed that. I think many legislators thought this would go to May 11th, and then we would have a sit down and figure out how the state would move forward from there. But he said, no, we're going to go beyond that, and I'm going to use my Secretary of Health to exceed those 60 days. He's completely abandoned the emergency declaration, and it's one of the reasons we're in court. So, I think there is pushback. We need better information, more explanations. They have no tracing program going on that we can speak of. There's a lot of things that are going on in other states that, quite honestly, are led by Democrat governors as well, and they're just further ahead from where Wisconsin is. We seem to be waiting for the governor to take a leadership role, and it just hasn't happened so far.
My interview with the senator continues now on our website, where I'm asking him about going forward with the April 7th election during the pandemic. You'll find that on the upfront section of WISN.com. Democratic lawmakers are backing the governor's extended order. I talk with Senate Minority Leader Janet Bewley. What do you make of the Republicans' lawsuit?
It is unfortunate. I would assume that at some level, they're really concerned about the health of the people of Wisconsin. But I'm afraid that at the highest level, this is being motivated by consolidating power. They would offer at first that this is something that needed to be done, but in a way they're saying by God, not by the governor or by anybody that's at the head of an agency. Well, right now that's what it is. This is what we have. These are the people who do have the power to make these kinds of decisions. And I'm not really hearing that they're the wrong decisions. In fact, when you compare what Wisconsin is doing to what the president released last week about those steps that we need to take in order to determine if we're ready, they correspond almost completely. So why this outrage? Well, it's because they want to move as much power from the governor to the legislature.
Do you think DHS Secretary Designee Andrea Palm is acting within her power?
I do. This is a health emergency. If not her, then who? And of course, the Republicans will say the legislature. We're not made up of doctors. The legislature is made up of good old folks. Me and you, we go and we represent people that send us here, the people in my district. I am not a doctor. I want to have on hand the health experts that are going to put us in the place where we are going to make good decisions.
What do you say to the record number of people who are unemployed right now who really just want to get back to work?
Oh, that I understand what they're going through. I really do. It is right here. It is on Main Street. It is in this very, very small towns that have maybe 4 businesses and 3 of them are closed. These are folks that really do need that paycheck and that feel so sad for the employees that they can no longer keep on the payroll. That's why we need to make sure that they have access to all of the information that they need to the next round of the payroll protection money that's going to be coming from the federal government. We've got to do everything that we can to make sure that we can get people on unemployment and that we can get funds to them through what is coming to the state of Wisconsin from the CARES Act. And I hope through state legislation so that we can put forth some programs right here that are specifically tailored to the people of Wisconsin.
Later on Up Front, Milwaukee makes a move that could dramatically increase absentee voting in the city. But first, classroom learning is over for Wisconsin students. Can educators make up for all this lost time? And what about the fall semester?